The air, thick with the scent of diesel and damp earth, tasted of finality. Alistair Finch stood on the fractured pavement, a lone figure of bespoke tailoring against a backdrop of urban decay. His shoes, Italian leather polished to a mirror sheen, were a stark insult to the scattered gravel and weeds. Before him, the great yellow beast of a bulldozer idled, its engine a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building it was tasked to destroy. St. Jude's Orphanage for Foundling Children. The name itself was an antiquity, a relic of a more sentimental age. To Alistair, it was merely Lot 734, a cancerous plot of prime real estate he'd acquired in a portfolio of distressed assets. The structure was a brick-and-mortar ghost, its windows like vacant eyes, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It had outlived its purpose. He raised his hand, the signal practiced and precise, a conductor ready to strike the first thunderous note of a symphony of destruction. His foreman, a burly man named Gus with a face like a road map of construction sites, nodded and lifted his radio. But before the command could be relayed, a flicker of movement, small and impossibly defiant, caught Alistair's eye. A child. A little girl, no older than 8, had slipped under the yellow caution tape. She walked with a strange, solemn purpose directly into the path of the bulldozer, stopping a mere 20 feet from its massive, dirt-caked blade. She wore a faded blue dress and clutched a threadbare teddy bear to her chest. "Hold!" Alistair's voice was sharp, cutting through the engine's rumble. Gus froze, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The girl just stood there, a tiny sentinel guarding a lost cause. She wasn't crying. Her face, smudged with a streak of dirt, was set with a resolve that was utterly out of place on a child. In her free hand, she held up a small rectangular object, a photograph, curled and brown with age. Her voice, when it came, was clear and piping, carrying across the space with unnerving clarity. "You can't," she said, not to Gus, but directly to Alistair. "You can't knock down my home. He wouldn't want you to." Alistair felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. This was a tactic, a pathetic last-ditch PR stunt orchestrated by the bleeding hearts who ran this place. He started forward, his patience, always a finite resource, evaporating in the morning sun. "Get the child out of here," he snapped at Gus. But as he drew closer, he saw the photograph she was holding. It was of a woman and a young boy, standing on the very steps of this decrepit building. The boy was thin, with eyes too big for his face, and a haircut that was brutally practical. Alistair's stride faltered. The world seemed to tilt, the sound of the idling engine fading to a dull buzz in his ears. The boy in the picture. He knew that boy. He knew that hollow look in his eyes, that desperate hope. He knew him with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. It was him. Alistair felt the blood drain from his face, a cold tide pulling away from his skin, leaving it tight and numb. The city noise, the impatient grunts of machinery, the very air he was breathing, all receded into a distant, muffled roar. All that existed was the small, defiant figure of the girl, and the impossible image she held in her hand. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the frayed ear of the teddy bear, the determined set of her small chin. His throat was dry, a desert of disbelief. "Where?" he began, his voice a hoarse rasp that was alien to him. "Did you get that?" The girl did not flinch. Her gaze was steady, her eyes a deep, clear brown that held no fear, only a strange, ancient knowing. "It's from the box," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "The box of lost things. It belongs to the boy who promised he'd come back for us. He wouldn't want you to break his home. The boy who promised he'd come back." The words were nonsense, the ramblings of a child, fed a diet of fairy tales and desperation, and yet they landed like stones in the pit of Alistair's stomach. He had made no such promise. He had spent a lifetime running from this place, burying the memory of it under layers of steel, glass, and billion-dollar contracts. He had erased the boy, in that photograph, remade himself from nothing, from the dirt of this very ground. Gus had lumbered over, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Mr. Finch, you want me to call someone? Social services, maybe? We can have her removed." Alistair didn't hear him. He couldn't tear his eyes from the photograph. The woman beside the boy, her face was a blur of forgotten details, a ghost of a memory he had long since locked away. But the feeling she evoked, a deep, resonant ache of loss, was as real and as sharp as a shard of glass in his heart. He remembered a hand, calloused but gentle, stroking his hair. He remembered the faint scent of lavender and soap. He remembered tears. Whose tears? Hers? His? He shook his head, a violent, involuntary motion to clear the fog. This was absurd, a coincidence, a trick of the light, of memory. The Finch Corporation did not halt nine-figure development projects for coincidences. "Get her out of the way," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, hard-edged authority. But the words lacked conviction, even to his own ears. Gus hesitated, looking from his boss's pale, strained face to the unflinching child. "Sir?" The girl took a step closer, her bravery astonishing. She lowered the photograph and held out the teddy bear. "His name is Alfie," she said, holding the bear's worn paw out towards Alistair. "Just like the boy. His name was Alfie, too." Alfie. A name he hadn't heard in 50 years. A name that belonged to another life, another world. It was a key, turning a lock deep within him, a lock he hadn't even known was there. The gates of memory groaned open, and a torrent of unwelcome sensations washed over him. The starchy feel of a donated shirt, the metallic taste of powdered milk, the ever-present chill of the dormitory, a cold that seeped into your bones and never truly left. He felt a wave of dizziness, the carefully constructed edifice of his life swaying on its foundations. He saw not a derelict building, but a sanctuary. He saw not a grubby orphan, but a guardian of a past he had murdered. He took a staggering step back, his hand coming up to brace himself against the cold steel of a nearby barricade. The metal was shockingly real, an anchor in the swirling vortex of his past. "Stop!" he commanded, the word torn from him. "Stop everything, for today." Gus's jaw dropped. "Mr. Finch, the demolition permits are timed. The investors... Do you have a problem with your hearing, Gus?" Alistair's voice was dangerously low, laced with the icy threat that had made him a legend in the boardroom. "I said stop. For today. Get your men out of here. Now." Gus, recognizing the tone that brooked no argument, finally snapped into action, barking orders into his radio. The growl of the bulldozer died with a final, shuddering cough, leaving a silence that was more profound, more deafening than the noise it replaced. Alistair Finch, the man who never hesitated, who never looked back, was left standing in that silence, staring at a little girl who held the ghost of his forgotten self in her hand. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she wanted. All he knew was that she had, with a faded photograph and a forgotten name, brought his entire world to a grinding, terrifying halt. The 24-hour reprieve he had granted was not a gift of compassion. It was an act of self-preservation. He needed to understand. He needed to dissect this anomaly, this ghost from the machine, and neutralize it before it could do any more damage. He retreated to the sterile sanctuary of his limousine, the plush leather and tinted windows a welcome barrier against the raw, unsettling reality of the street. He instructed his driver to take him back to the office, the 40-story glass tower that bore his name, a monument to the man he had become. But as the car pulled away, his eyes were drawn back to the orphanage. The little girl was gone from the demolition site, but he saw her a moment later, standing on the top step, framed by the peeling paint of the main door. She wasn't looking at him. She was talking to the teddy bear, her small face serious, as if consulting with an old and trusted friend. The image was so achingly familiar, it made his chest tighten. He had done that. He had whispered his fears and his secrets into the stitched ear of a stuffed animal, the only confidant he'd had in a world of strangers. The memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. A small, lumpy dog, not a bear, with one button eye. He'd called it Patches. What had happened to Patches? The question was a pinprick, but it drew a surprising amount of blood. He had forgotten Patches. He had forgotten so much. Back in his office, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city he had conquered, Alistair tried to immerse himself in the familiar rhythms of his empire. Spreadsheets, projections, acquisition reports. These were the languages he understood, the solid, quantifiable realities of his world. But the numbers blurred, the crisp black ink turning into the faded brown tones of an old photograph. The skyline outside his window seemed to mock him, a testament to a future he had built by systematically annihilating his past. He couldn't shake the girl's face, her solemn eyes. He couldn't silence her words. The box of lost things. The boy who promised he'd come back. He buzzed his executive assistant, a woman named Eleanor, who had been with him for 15 years and was more of an operational commander than a secretary. She was efficient, unflappable, and utterly discreet. "Eleanor," he said, his voice flatter than usual, "I need you to find out everything you can about a property. St. Jude's Orphanage for foundling children. Not the asset details. I have those. I want the history, the people, who runs it now. I want to know about the children who live there." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor was likely surprised. Alistair Finch had never before expressed the slightest interest in the human component of his acquisitions. They were liabilities, line items to be cleared. "Of course, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone as professional as ever. "Is there anything specific I should be looking for?" He hesitated. How could he explain what he was looking for? Find a record of a ghost. Find a boy named Alfie who looks like me. Find out if I am going insane. "Just, be thorough," he managed. "And Eleanor, be discreet. I don't want a single word of this leaking. No media, no one. This is an internal matter." "Understood, Mr. Finch." The line went dead. Alistair swiveled in his chair and stared out at the city. He was a man who controlled narratives, who shaped reality with capital and concrete. But for the first time, in a very long time, he felt a profound and terrifying loss of control. A child with a photograph had rewritten his day, his focus, his very sense of self. He had built his life on the principle that the past was irrelevant, a dead weight to be cut loose. Now it was reaching out from its grave, threatening to pull him under. The rest of the day was a blur of feigned productivity. He attended meetings, his mind a million miles away. He signed documents worth more than most countries' GDPs, his hand moving on autopilot. He was a machine performing its functions, but the operator was absent, lost in a fog of half-remembered sorrows. He canceled his dinner engagement, a crucial meeting with a consortium of Japanese investors. The excuse he gave was a sudden illness, a lie that felt uncomfortably close to the truth. He felt sick, hollowed out. He went home, not to his sprawling penthouse, a sterile museum of modern art and success, but to the old family home he had inherited and kept shuttered for decades. He never went there. It was in a quiet, leafy suburb, a place he had long since outgrown. It was filled with ghosts of a different sort, the ghosts of his parents, of a life before Finch Corporation, before the reinvention. The air inside was stale, thick with the dust of unopened years. He didn't turn on the lights, navigating the familiar layout by instinct. He found his father's study and poured himself a generous measure of brandy, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep inside him. In the dark, he sank into his father's worn leather armchair and let the memories he had fought so hard to suppress finally have their way with him. He didn't remember leaving the orphanage. That part of his life was a black hole, a void. His memory picked up later, in a small, cramped apartment with his father, a man broken by grief and failure. His mother was gone. The official story, the one he was told, and the one he clung to, was that she had died suddenly from a fever while he was away visiting relatives. There had been no relatives. There had only been St. Jude's. Why had his father lied? Why the elaborate charade? The questions multiplied, breeding in the darkness of the study. He had never questioned it before. He had accepted his father's version of the past because it was easier, because questioning it meant opening a door to a pain he couldn't bear to face. He had been a child, and children are experts at survival. His survival had depended on forgetting. The next morning, Eleanor's report was on his desk, a slim, unassuming file that felt heavier than a block of lead. He opened it with trembling hands. It contained the expected information. The orphanage was a non-profit, run by an elderly director named Agnes Gable, operating on a shoestring budget, perpetually on the verge of collapse. It housed 12 children, ranging in age from 5 to 16. And then he saw her name, Lily Carter, age 8. Admitted at age 3, abandoned at a local hospital. No known relatives. There was a small, grainy photograph attached to her file. It was the girl. He read on, his eyes scanning the dry, bureaucratic text. The report detailed Mrs. Gable's tireless but failing efforts to fundraise, the litany of repairs the building desperately needed, the city's endless citations for code violations. It was a portrait of quiet desperation. Tucked at the back of the report was a section Eleanor had titled Historical Notes of Interest. His breath caught in his throat. Eleanor's research was, as always, impeccable. She had unearthed a digital copy of an old admissions ledger from the 1970s, and there it was in faded, spidery cursive. Finch, Alfred, age 6. Admitted October 12, 1975. Temporary placement. Reason, family hardship, maternal illness. Discharged April 3, 1976. 6 months. He had been there for 6 months. It wasn't a brief visit. It was a season of his life, a chapter that had been ripped from his memory. maternal illness. Not a sudden fever, a prolonged illness. The lie his father had told him began to unravel, exposing the raw, ugly truth beneath. His mother hadn't just died. She had been sick, and they had been poor. So poor that his father couldn't care for him. So poor that he had been given away, handed over to strangers. The shame of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Alistair Finch, the titan of industry, the self-made man, had started his life as a charity case. A foundling. He closed the file, his hands clammy. The 24-hour reprieve was nearly up. The bulldozers would be waiting. The investors would be demanding answers. The logical, ruthless part of his brain, the part that had made him his fortune, screamed at him to bury this. Demolish the building. Demolish the memories. Move on. It was the only sane thing to do. But another voice, a smaller, weaker voice he hadn't heard in 50 years, whispered a single, devastating question. What about the promise? He didn't go to the site. He couldn't. Instead, he sent a message to Gus. Stand down until further notice. The response was a single, bewildered, "Sir," which he ignored. He knew the delay would cost him millions in penalties and ignite a firestorm with his partners. He didn't care. The numbers on a spreadsheet suddenly seemed laughably insignificant. He spent the morning pacing his office, the city below a meaningless map. He was not a man given to introspection or sentimentality. He was a man of action, of decisive, forward momentum. But he was paralyzed. The past, once a distant, conquered territory, had staged an invasion, and he had no defenses against it. He found himself staring at the grainy photo of Lily Carter, her eyes so serious and knowing. What did she know? How could she know? The box of lost things. It sounded like something a child would invent. A repository for forgotten toys, for stories, for hope. It was time to stop dealing with reports and ledgers. It was time to face the ghost. He told his driver to take him to St. Jude's. He didn't take the Rolls-Royce. He took a nondescript black sedan from the company's fleet. He wanted no attention, no ceremony. This was not a visit from a developer. This was something else entirely. As the car turned onto the familiar cracked street, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The building looked different in the afternoon light, less like a ghost and more like a weary old soldier, battered but still standing. There were children in the small, patchy yard, their shouts and laughter a stark contrast to the silence of the previous morning. He saw her immediately, Lily. She was sitting on the steps, not far from where she had stood sentinel, carefully drawing in a notebook with a stub of a pencil. The teddy bear, Alfie, sat beside her. Alistair got out of the car, his movements stiff. He felt as conspicuous as a wolf in a sheep pen. A few of the older children stopped their game to stare at him, their curiosity mixed with a healthy dose of suspicion. They knew who he was. He was the man who was going to tear down their home. He walked up the path, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. Lily looked up as his shadow fell over her. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply closed her notebook and looked at him with those unnervingly steady eyes. "You came back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I need to speak with the person in charge," Alistair said, his voice more formal than he intended. "Mrs. Gable?" Lily nodded. "She's inside, in the office. She's worried about the boiler again." She stood up, tucking the notebook under her arm. "Are you going to knock our house down now?" I haven't decided." The admission felt like a monumental concession. Alastair Finch always decided. Indecision was a weakness he did not tolerate in himself or others. "You shouldn't," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's a good house. It's just old. And Alfie's things are here." She patted the teddy bear's head. "The other Alfie." She led him inside. The interior of the orphanage was a shock to his system. It smelled exactly as he remembered, a strange, not unpleasant combination of institutional floor polish, simmering soup, and damp wool. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a familiar song of protest. The walls were lined with children's artwork, a riot of color and chaotic energy. It wasn't derelict. It was worn, yes, faded, but it was alive. It was a home. The office was a small, cluttered room, overflowing with stacks of paper, precariously balanced files, and chipped coffee mugs. A woman sat behind the desk, her back to the door, hunched over a large, clanking radiator, a wrench in her hand. She had silver hair tied in a loose bun, and wore a thick knitted cardigan despite the warmth of the day. "Honestly, Bartholomew," she muttered to the radiator, "you have one job. Just one. To get hot. It's not quantum physics." She gave the pipe a final, frustrated whack with the wrench. "Mrs. Gable?" Alastair said from the doorway. The woman straightened up with a groan and turned. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles. Her eyes, a pale, watery blue, that lit up with surprise, then narrowed with immediate suspicion and hostility. She placed the wrench on the desk with a heavy thud. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice laced with ice, "to what do we owe the honor? Have you come to watch your wrecking ball take its first swing? I hope you'll forgive me for not rolling out the red carpet." Lily, who had been standing quietly beside Alastair, stepped forward. "He said he hasn't decided yet, Mrs. Gable." The old woman's gaze softened as she looked at the child, but when her eyes returned to Alastair, they were as hard as granite. "Is that so? A reprieve from the king? We should all be so grateful." "I'm not here to debate the demolition," Alastair said, cutting through the sarcasm. He felt his corporate armor sliding back into place, a necessary defense against this woman's palpable disdain. "I am here on a matter of historical inquiry. I understand you have a collection of some sort, a box of lost things." Mrs. Gable's eyebrows shot up. She exchanged a look with Lily, a silent, lightning-fast communication that Alastair could not decipher. "It's not a museum, Mr. Finch. It's just a few keepsakes left behind by children over the years. Trinkets. Things of no value to anyone but them. I have reason to believe an item in that box may pertain to a former resident." Alastair pressed on, the words feeling stiff and unnatural in his mouth. "A boy who was here in the mid-70s. His name was Alfred Finch." The name hung in the air between them. Mrs. Gable's hostile expression slowly melted away, replaced by one of profound, utter shock. Her hand went to her mouth. She sank back into her chair, her eyes searching Alastair's face, really looking at him for the first time, not as a heartless developer, but as a man. "Alfred," she whispered, the name a fragile thing. "Alfie! Good heavens! I remember the name from the files. A sad case. His mother—" She trailed off, her gaze flicking again to Lily, who was now watching the exchange with wide, fascinated eyes. "Lily, my dear," Mrs. Gable said, her voice suddenly gentle, "why don't you go and help Mr. Henderson in the garden for a bit? I think the tomatoes need watering." Lily looked like she wanted to protest, but a quiet look from the director was enough. She nodded, gave Alastair one last, long look, and slipped out of the room. When she was gone, Mrs. Gable let out a long, slow breath. She looked at Alistair, her old animosity gone, replaced by a weary, cautious curiosity. "Why, Mr. Finch, after all these years? Why are you asking about this now?" "That," Alistair said, his voice tight, "is my business. The box, Mrs. Gable. I need to see it." Mrs. Gable studied him for a long moment, her head tilted. It felt like she was looking straight through his expensive suit, through the years of ruthless ambition, and seeing the scared, skinny 6-year-old boy cowering beneath it all. She seemed to come to a decision. Without another word, she stood, walked to a large, dusty metal filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a key from her pocket. She unlocked the bottom drawer, and, with a grunt of effort, pulled out a large, battered cardboard box, bound with yellowing twine. She heaved it onto her desk, sending up a small puff of dust that danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the window. The box of lost things. It was real. She untied the twine, her movements slow and deliberate, and lifted the lid. The contents were a chaotic jumble of childhood treasures. A single roller skate with a missing wheel, a small china doll with a cracked face, a handful of marbles that shimmered like captured galaxies, a silver locket tarnished with age. It was a graveyard of forgotten affections. Mrs. Gable began to sift through the items, her hands surprisingly gentle. "Most of the children, when they leave, they have nothing, so they take nothing with them. But sometimes a child has to leave in a hurry, or they pass something down to another child. A totem, a piece of hope. Over the decades, it all ends up in here." Her hands stopped. She lifted something from the box. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its paint worn away, its shape smoothed by the touch of countless small hands. "The legend, as the children tell it," Mrs. Gable said softly, her eyes fixed on the bird, "is that this belonged to a boy who had to leave suddenly. He told his friend he'd be back for it, but he never was. He promised. So, the children, they've kept it safe. For him. They call it the Promise Bird." She held it out to him. Alistair looked at the bird, resting in her wrinkled palm. The world contracted to that single point. He remembered. The memory was a physical jolt, like an electric shock. He was in the dormitory, huddled under a thin, scratchy blanket. It was cold, so cold. A woman, a caregiver with a kind, tired face, was sitting on the edge of his cot. She was pressing something into his hand. "Your mother wanted you to have this," she had whispered. "She made it for you, so you'll never forget how much she loves you. So you'll remember she's always with you." It was the bird. He had clutched it every night, the smooth wood a comfort against his cheek. He had whispered his secrets to it. He had prayed to it. And then one day it was gone. A bigger boy, a bully named Ronan, had snatched it from him. He had fought for it, a desperate, wild fury, but he was small and weak. He never saw it again. The loss of it had been a greater blow than any punch. It was the loss of his last connection to his mother. He reached out, his hand unsteady, and took the bird from Mrs. Gable. The wood was warm, almost alive, in his palm. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for no other hand. The room was silent, save for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. He stood there, a billionaire in a bespoke suit, holding a small wooden bird in a dusty office, and he felt the carefully constructed walls of his life begin to crumble into dust. He wasn't Alistair Finch, titan of industry. He was Alfie, a lost little boy who had just found the only thing he had ever truly owned. The boy, Mrs. Gable's voice was barely a whisper. It was you. Alistair couldn't speak. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. He was choking on 50 years of unshed tears, the grief he had buried, the pain he had outrun. It was all here, in this room, in this small, carved piece of wood. It had waited for him. He sank into the visitor's chair opposite the desk, the bird clutched in his hand. He felt hollowed out, exposed. Mrs. Gable sat back down, her expression one of dawning, sorrowful understanding. She did not press him for details. She simply sat with him in the quiet, dusty office, allowing him the dignity of his silent collapse. Outside, he could hear the children's laughter, a sound that had once been an irritating noise, but now felt like a lifeline. After what felt like an eternity, he finally found his voice. It was a stranger's voice, rough and broken. "My mother," he said, looking at Mrs. Gable. "The records said the maternal illness. What happened to her?" Mrs. Gable's face was full of compassion. She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. The original, not a digital copy. She flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages, her finger tracing the lines of faded ink until she found the entry she was looking for. "Your file is thin, Alfred," she said gently, using his old name without a trace of irony. "There wasn't much information given. It says here your mother, Eleanor Finch, was admitted to the city sanatorium. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, a death sentence in those days, for the poor. The sanatorium was a place people went to die, a grim holding pen on the edge of the city." He remembered his father's frantic, whispered conversations, the hushed, fearful tone whenever the sanatorium was mentioned. He had been told she was getting better, that she'd be home soon. Another lie. All of it, his entire childhood, was built on a foundation of benevolent, heartbreaking lies, designed to protect a small boy from a truth too terrible to bear. "There are letters," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice soft. She reached back into the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the one that held the box, and pulled out a thin manila folder tied with a ribbon. "From her, to the director, at the time, Mr. Abernathy. We keep everything. It's a rule of St. Jude's. Every child's story is sacred." She untied the ribbon and slid a small stack of envelopes onto the desk. The paper was fragile, the handwriting a delicate, elegant cursive that felt both familiar and alien. He picked up the top letter, his name written on the envelope, in his mother's hand. "For my dearest Alfie." He opened it. The letter was dated a week after he was admitted. "My darling boy," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well, and that you are being brave. I know you must be scared, but the people at St. Jude's are kind, and they will take good care of you until I can come for you. I think of you every moment of every day. I see your face when I close my eyes. I miss your laughter more than words can say. Your father visits me when he can, after his work, but he is so tired. This is for the best, my love. It is only for a little while. Be a good boy. Remember your manners, and never forget how much your mummy loves you more than all the stars in the sky." He read through the other letters, a chronicle of a mother's love and a losing battle. Her handwriting grew weaker, more erratic, with each passing week. She wrote of her hopes for his future, of the books she wanted to read to him, of the places she wanted to take him. She never once mentioned that she was dying. The final letter was different. It wasn't in an envelope. It was a single, folded sheet of paper, the writing faint and shaky. It was addressed to Mr. Abernethy. Dear Mr. Abernethy, the time has come. The doctors tell me it is only a matter of days now. Please do not tell my son. Let his father tell him in his own time, in his own way. All I ask is that you give him the enclosed bird. I carved it myself, in the long hours of the night. It is a promise that I will always be watching over him, even when he cannot see me. Tell him his mother loves him. Tell him to be strong. Tell him to be a good man. And please, I beg of you, look after my boy. He is my whole world. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Finch. Alistair folded the letter, his movements slow and reverent. He placed it back on the desk, along with the others. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of a 50-year-old sorrow. The tough, impenetrable shell he had built around his heart had been shattered, and he was left adrift in a sea of grief he never knew he had. He had spent his life believing he had been abandoned, that his mother had been snatched away by a random act of fate. The truth was so much more painful and so much more profound. She hadn't abandoned him. She had saved him. She had endured the agony of giving him up so that he might have a chance to live. Her final thoughts had been of him, his entire life, his relentless drive, his insatiable need for success and control. It had all been a reaction to a false premise. He had been trying to build a fortress so high that no one could ever hurt him or leave him again. He had been running from the ghost of a 6-year-old boy who felt worthless and alone. But he hadn't been alone. He had been loved, deeply, fiercely, sacrificially. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Gable. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. "Thank you for keeping these." "As I said, Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice thick with emotion, "every child's story is sacred." He stood up, the wooden bird still clutched in his hand. He felt changed. The anger and the emptiness that had been his constant companions for as long as he could remember were gone, replaced by a deep, aching sadness, but also by something else, a connection, a sense of belonging he had never felt before. This place, this crumbling old building he had been so eager to destroy, was not just a property. It was his history. It was his mother's last act of love. It was the place that had kept her promise safe for him all these years. He walked to the door of the office. "The demolition," he said, his back to her. "It's canceled. Permanently." He heard her sharp intake of breath. What will you do?" she stammered. "The land is worth a fortune." He turned to face her, and for the first time he let her see the truth in his eyes. The vulnerability, the grief, the ghost of the boy named Alfie. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth more than a fortune." He walked out of the office and back into the main hallway. The orphanage was no longer a place of shame. It was a monument. As he headed for the front door, he saw Lily. She was sitting on the bottom step of the main staircase, her drawing pad in her lap. She had clearly been waiting for him. She looked from his face to the wooden bird in his hand. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. "You found it?" she whispered. He knelt down in front of her, the movement feeling surprisingly natural. He was no longer the towering, intimidating Mr. Finch. He was just a man brought to his knees by the past. He held out the bird. "It was yours all along, wasn't it?" she asked. "It was just waiting for you to come home." Home. The word resonated through him. He looked around at the faded walls, at the scuffed floors, at the sound of children playing in the yard. This place had been his first home, after he'd lost his mother. It had sheltered him. It had kept his story safe. He had come here to destroy a building, but he had ended up finding himself. "Lily," he said, his voice hoarse, "the box. Where did you first hear about the story? About the boy?" "Everyone knows it," she said, shrugging. "Mrs. Gable tells it to the new kids, so they don't feel so alone. She says St. Jude's remembers everyone, even the ones who forget us. Even the ones who forget us." The words were a gentle indictment. He had forgotten. He had tried so hard to erase this place and its people from his memory, but they had never forgotten him. They had kept his story, his mother's love, his promise, alive. He looked at the intelligent, solemn little girl in front of him. She had been the catalyst, the guardian of the gate to his own past. With an unshakable, childlike faith, she had stood in front of a bulldozer, armed with nothing more than a story, and she had won. "Thank you, Lily," he said, the words coming from a place of profound, humbling gratitude. "You saved more than just a house today." She simply beamed at him, a radiant, gap-toothed smile that seemed to light up the dim hallway. In that moment, Alistair Finch knew that his life, the one he had so carefully and ruthlessly constructed, was over. And a new one, a life he couldn't yet imagine, was just beginning. The days that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. Alistair Finch did not do things by halves. The decision to save St. Jude's was not a passive act of cancellation. It was the beginning of a full-scale invasion of philanthropy. He dispatched a legion of his best people, not lawyers and demolition experts, but architects, engineers, and social workers to descend upon the orphanage. Mrs. Gable, initially overwhelmed and deeply suspicious, found herself in a whirlwind of assessments, blueprints, and budget meetings that made her head spin. Alistair's first order of business was to establish the Finch Foundation, a massive charitable entity endowed with a significant portion of his personal fortune. Its sole initial mandate was the complete restoration and ongoing support of St. Jude's. The news sent shockwaves through the financial world. Alistair Finch, the shark, the ruthless corporate raider, had apparently grown a heart. His investors were furious, his rivals bewildered. The media went into a frenzy, spinning wild theories about a health scare, a midlife crisis, or a clever tax evasion scheme. Alistair ignored them all. He was a man possessed by a new purpose. He didn't just want to fix the leaky roof and the faulty boiler. He wanted to transform St. Jude's into a sanctuary, a model of what a home for children should be. He personally oversaw the plans, rejecting sterile, institutional designs in favor of warm, light-filled spaces, a state-of-the-art kitchen, a library filled with books, an art and music room, and a garden that would be the envy of the city. But his involvement was more than just financial. He found himself drawn to the orphanage, not as its benefactor, but as a visitor. He started showing up in the late afternoons, after his workday was officially over. At first, his presence was an awkward one. The children were shy around him, whispering and pointing at the rich man in the fancy suit. Mrs. Gable and her small, overworked staff treated him with a polite but distant deference. He was still the outsider, the alien who had almost destroyed their world. The ice began to break, slowly, because of Lily. She was his ambassador, his bridge to this world he no longer understood. She would simply walk up to him, take his hand, and lead him to see a new drawing she had made, or show him a ladybug she had found in the garden. She treated him not as Mr. Finch, the billionaire, but as Alfie, the boy who had come home. She was fearless in her affection, and through her, the other children began to see him differently. One afternoon, he found a group of the older boys struggling to repair a broken go-kart. Their tools were old and rusted, their frustration palpable. The Alistair of a month ago would have simply written a check for a dozen new go-karts. But this new Alistair, the one who was relearning how to be human, rolled up the sleeves of his $1,000 shirt, knelt down in the dirt, and asked to see the problem. He had always had a mind for mechanics, for how things fit together. Within an hour, using the boy's own subpar tools, he had the axle realigned and the chain tightened. He was covered in grease and dirt. His suit was probably ruined. But the look of awe and respect on the boys' faces was worth more than any corporate merger. That was the day he stopped being the man who was going to knock our house down and started becoming just Alistair. He began to learn their names, their stories. There was Leo, the quiet 16-year-old who was a genius at chess and terrified of aging out of the system. There was Maya, a 12-year-old girl who dreamed of being an astronaut and read encyclopedias for fun. There was Sam and Chloe, 5-year-old twins who had never been separated and communicated in a language of their own. Each of them was a survivor, a small soul weathering a storm. Alistair was only just beginning to comprehend. In them, he saw himself. He saw their fierce resilience, their desperate need for stability and love. His interactions with Mrs. Gable also began to thaw. He saw her not as a hostile obstacle, but as a woman of incredible strength and dedication who had kept this place running on, little more than sheer force of will. He saw the way she knew which child needed a hug, which one needed a quiet word of encouragement, and which one just needed to be left alone. She was the mother this house had needed, the mother he had barely known. One evening, as they were going over the final architectural plans in her cluttered office, she looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. "You know," she said, her tone unexpectedly soft, "your mother would be so proud of you." The comment caught him off guard. He had been so focused on the mechanics of the project, on the logistics and the funding, that he hadn't fully processed the emotional core of what he was doing. He was honoring his mother's last wish. Look after my boy. Tell him to be a good man. He was 50 years late, but he was finally trying to be the good man she had wanted him to be. "I hope so," he said, his voice thick. The renovation was a massive undertaking. The children and staff were temporarily relocated to a comfortable, leased property nearby, a move Alistair funded entirely. He insisted that the children be involved in the design process, letting them pick colors for their rooms and offer ideas for the playground. St. Jude's was stripped down to its bones and lovingly rebuilt. The old brick facade was preserved and restored, but the inside was transformed. He visited the construction site daily, not as a client, but as a hands-on supervisor. The foreman, Gus, who had been ready to demolish the place, now treated the project with a kind of religious reverence. "Never seen anything like it, Mr. Finch," he said one day, shaking his head in disbelief as they watched a crane install a state-of-the-art solar panel on the new roof. "It's more than a building now. It's a statement." Alistair knew what he meant. It was a statement of atonement. It was an apology to the boy he had been, and a promise to the children who were there now. During this time, he also began to quietly, systematically dismantle parts of his old life. He delegated more and more of the day-to-day operations of Finch Corporation to his trusted executives. He sold his sterile penthouse and moved into the old family home, the one he had avoided for so long. He had it aired out, cleaned, and filled with comfortable, unpretentious furniture. He found that he didn't need the trappings of wealth anymore. The things that brought him comfort were simpler: the smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of a crackling fire, the feel of the worn wooden bird in his pocket, a constant, tactile reminder of his new path. His relationship with Lily deepened. He became the closest thing she had to a father. He helped her with her homework, read her bedtime stories, and listened with rapt attention to her imaginative tales. He learned that her prized possession, besides the teddy bear Alfie, was her drawing pad. She was a talented little artist, capturing the world around her with a unique and poignant eye. One afternoon, she showed him a drawing she had made. It was of a tall man in a suit, kneeling down to talk to a little girl, a huge yellow bulldozer, sitting silent and defeated in the background. "That's the day you remembered," she said simply. He felt a lump form in his throat. He had commissioned a portrait of himself once from a world-famous artist. It had cost him over $1 million and now sat in storage. It had captured nothing. This simple pencil drawing, made by an 8-year-old girl, captured everything. As the new St. Jude's neared completion, Alistair made a decision. It was a radical one, something that would once have been unthinkable. He started the legal proceedings to become Lily's foster parent, with the intention of adopting her. The process was arduous. His age, his single status, his high-profile life, all were scrutinized. But his lawyers were the best, and his new-found purpose was undeniable. More importantly, when the social workers interviewed Lily, her desire to be with him was absolute and unwavering. The grand reopening of St. Jude's was a quiet affair. There was no media, no fanfare. Just Alistair, Mrs. Gable, the staff, and the 12 children. As they walked through the bright, beautiful new building, their faces filled with wonder, Alistair felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that no business deal had ever given him. The dormitories were gone, replaced by comfortable bedrooms, with no more than 2 children to a room. The dingy basement was now a gleaming recreation room with a small movie theater. The patchy yard was a lush green space with a brand new playground and a thriving vegetable garden. At the center of the garden, under a newly planted oak tree, Alistair had placed a simple, elegant stone bench. It was dedicated to the memory of Eleanor Finch. A mother's love is a promise that is never broken. Later that day, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the new building, Alistair was sitting on that bench. Lily came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's a really good house now," she said sleepily. "Yes, it is," Alistair agreed, putting his arm around her. He looked at the building, his building, the one he had saved from himself. It was more than just brick and mortar. It was a testament to the fact that it is never too late to change, never too late to come home. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of steel and glass, a fortress to keep the world out. But a little girl with a teddy bear and a forgotten photograph had shown him that true strength wasn't in walls, but in connections. His greatest acquisition wasn't a company or a property. It was a family. He had come to St. Jude's to demolish a piece of his past, But in the end, the past had rebuilt him. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden bird. He was no longer running. He was finally, truly, home. The legal process for Lily's adoption was finalized on a crisp autumn morning, a year after the reopening of St. Jude's. The courtroom was quiet, the proceedings a formality. When the judge pronounced them father and daughter, Alistair lifted Lily into his arms, and she hugged him with all her might, burying her face in his neck. There were no tears, just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. Alistair Finch was still a businessman, but his priorities had fundamentally shifted. The Finch Foundation grew, expanding its mission to support foster care programs, educational scholarships for underprivileged children, and family support services across the country. He became a leading voice in child advocacy, using his influence and resources to effect real change. Sarah, his once purely corporate lawyer, had found a new passion, and now ran the foundation with a fierce dedication that matched his own. St. Jude's thrived. With secure funding and passionate staff, it became a beacon of hope, a place where children were not just housed, but nurtured. Mrs. Gable finally retired, leaving the orphanage in the capable hands of a new director Alistair had handpicked. She didn't go far, though. She moved into a small cottage on the edge of the property that Alistair had built for her, and she remained the beloved grandmother of the house. Leo, the chess prodigy, graduated high school with top honors. The foundation awarded him a full scholarship to a prestigious university to study computer science. The fear of aging out of the system had been replaced by the bright promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. Alistair and Lily's home was filled with a warmth and laughter it had never known. The dusty, silent rooms were now home to art projects, sprawling Lego creations, and the sound of Lily practicing the piano, a talent Alistair had been delighted to discover. He learned the simple, profound joys of parenthood, the triumph of a loose tooth, the drama of a scraped knee, the quiet magic of a bedtime story. He was no longer just a billionaire, he was a dad. He taught Lily how to ride a bike, how to skip stones across the lake, how to play chess. In turn, she taught him how to be patient, how to be silly, how to see the wonder in small things. She healed the broken parts of him he hadn't even known existed. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning out the attic of the old house, they found a dusty, forgotten trunk. Inside, nestled amongst his father's old papers, was a small, cloth-bound book. It was a photo album, his mother's photo album. He sat on the floor with Lily, the dusty attic air thick with memories, and they turned the pages together. There were pictures of his mother as a young woman, her smile radiant and full of life. There were pictures of his parents' wedding, of their first small apartment. And then there were pictures of him. A baby, swaddled in a blanket. A toddler, taking his first steps. A little boy, laughing on a swing set, his mother's arms wrapped around him. He saw picture after picture of a childhood he had completely forgotten. A childhood filled with love and happiness, before the poverty and the sickness had descended. He had not been born into misery. He had been born into joy. In the back of the album, he found a photograph he had never seen before. It was of him, age 5, sitting on his mother's lap. She was helping him carve a small piece of wood with a dull pocket knife. They were making a bird. He stared at the image, his heart aching. He had thought the bird was something she had made for him in her final days. But the truth was, they had begun it together. It was a shared creation, a symbol not just of her love, but of their life together. He looked at Lily, whose eyes were wide with wonder. "That's your bird," she whispered in awe. He pulled the worn wooden bird from his pocket and placed it beside the photograph. The connection was complete. He finally understood. The promise wasn't just that his mother would watch over him. The promise was that the love they shared would endure, that it was strong enough to survive separation, sickness, and even death. It was a promise that had waited patiently for 50 years in a cardboard box, guarded by generations of children, until a little girl, with dirt on her face and faith in her heart, had delivered it back to him. He closed the album, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He had spent so long defining himself by what he had lost, by the emptiness he felt. But his life had not been empty. It had been filled with a love so powerful, it had crossed time to find him again. A few years later, on a sunny spring day, Alistair stood with a teenage Lily in the garden of St. Jude's, near his mother's memorial bench. The oak tree they had planted was tall and strong now, its leaves rustling in the breeze. The sounds of children's laughter filled the air. Lily was a young woman now, bright and confident, her artistic talent blossoming. Her latest painting, a beautiful landscape of the St. Jude's garden, was set to be displayed in a local gallery. He looked at her, his heart swelling with a love and pride so immense it almost hurt. She was the best part of him, the living embodiment of his second chance. "You know," she said, nudging him with her elbow, "for a ruthless billionaire, you're not so bad." He laughed, a real, easy laugh. The title felt like something from another lifetime, a costume he had long since shed. "It took me a while," he said, "but I had a good teacher." He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar smooth shape of the promise bird. He no longer needed to carry it everywhere he went, but he still did. It wasn't a totem of loss anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had found. He had come to this place to erase a painful memory, to tear down a monument to his own shame and vulnerability. But in doing so, he had learned that our past is not a prison to be escaped. It is a foundation upon which we build our future. And true wealth is not measured in dollars or buildings, but in the love we give, the promises we keep, and the homes we build in the hearts of others. The journey from that moment of reckoning on the demolition site had been one of slow, painful, and ultimately beautiful reconstruction, not of a building, but of a man. Alistair Finch had learned that the ghosts of the past could not be exorcised with money or power. They could only be understood and integrated. The boy named Alfie was no longer a specter of shame to be locked away, but a fundamental part of who he was. Embracing that scared, lonely child was the first step toward becoming a whole person. His relationship with Lily was the cornerstone of this new life. In her, he saw not a substitute for the family he'd lost, but the beginning of a new one, forged not by blood, but by a deeper, more resilient bond of shared experience and mutual rescue. He had given her a home and a future, and in return, she had given him back his own past and a reason to believe in something beyond the bottom line. He became a fixture at St. Jude's, known to the children simply as Alistair. He was the man who organized the annual camping trip, who could fix any broken toy, who told the best ghost stories, none of them too scary, and who always had time to listen. He discovered a playful, patient side of himself he never knew existed. The boardroom shark had been replaced by a surprisingly gentle patriarch. He found a particular joy in mentoring the older children, like Leo, who were preparing to leave the nest. He used his vast network of contacts not for hostile takeovers, but to secure internships, apprenticeships, and job opportunities for them. He wanted to ensure that when they aged out of St. Jude's, they didn't fall through the cracks, but stepped onto a solid bridge to a future of their own making. He established a transition program that provided housing support, financial literacy training, and ongoing mentorship for every child who left the orphanage, a safety net that would have been unimaginable in his own time. His own company, Finch Corporation, also underwent a quiet revolution. He remained chairman, but his focus shifted. The company began investing heavily in sustainable development, urban renewal projects that prioritized community spaces, and affordable housing initiatives. Profits were still important, but they were no longer the only metric of success. His board, initially resistant, was eventually won over by the simple fact that the new, more ethical Finch Corporation was not only more respected, but also more successful than ever. It turned out that building communities was more profitable in the long run than simply erecting buildings. The old family home, once a mausoleum of repressed memories, was now a place of warmth and life. Alistair and Lily hosted holidays there for the entire St. Jude's family, filling the once silent rooms with chaos, laughter, and the smell of Mrs. Gable's legendary apple pie. He would often find himself in his father's old study, not to drink brandy in the dark, but to help Lily with a school project, or to simply sit with her by the fire, reading. He had finally made peace with his father's memory, understanding that the lies he had been told were not acts of deception, but desperate acts of love from a grieving man trying to shield his son from a world of pain. He had forgiven his father for his weakness, and in doing so, had finally forgiven himself. He never remarried. His life with Lily, his extended family at St. Jude's, and his work with the foundation filled his days with a richness and purpose that left no room for anything else. He had found his soulmate not in a romantic partner, but in the collective spirit of the children he had dedicated his life to serving. One evening, years later, Alistair was watching an old black-and-white movie with Lily, now a young woman on the cusp of leaving for university to study architecture, a passion he had helped foster. On the screen, a character spoke the line, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Lily looked over at him. "That's you," she said with a smile. "Your past is always with you." He smiled back, his heart full. "Yes," he said, "but it's not a ghost anymore. It's an old friend." The wooden bird, the promise bird, now sat on the mantelpiece in the living room, nestled between a framed photo of his mother and Lily's first prize-winning painting. It was a quiet, constant reminder of the journey he had taken. A journey from a cold, empty penthouse overlooking a city he owned but did not love, to a warm, noisy house filled with the family he had chosen. Alistair Finch had started his story as a foundling, a boy lost to the system. He had remade himself into a king, ruling over a lonely empire of his own creation. But his true legacy, the one that would endure long after his name faded from the glass towers, was written in the lives of the children he had looked after. He had finally and fully fulfilled his mother's last wish. He had become a good man, and in saving one small, crumbling orphanage, he had built a home for his own heart, proving that the most valuable things in life are not the things we acquire, but the things we protect, the promises we keep, and the love we refuse to let be forgotten. This story is a reminder that compassion is the most valuable asset we possess. It shows that our past does not have to define our future, and that one small act of defiance, rooted in love and memory, can change the world. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations in your own community that provide care and support for vulnerable children and families. A small kindness can be a promise that lasts a lifetime.